There's a famous clip of Hall of Fame NFL coach Bill Parcells telling his players during a game, this is what you worked all offseason for. This is why you lift all them weights. And he's talking to them probably in the fourth quarter of a game, and he's trying to get them to realize that they can't give up when the game gets tough, especially now. Don't let all the blood, sweat, and tears in the weight room, in training camp, in practice turn out for nothing. And so coaches make it their goal to not let past accomplishments cause present complacency. Instead of resting on their laurels, athletes need to look to their past efforts as fuel for present endurance, present striving. And Hebrews, like a good head coach, exhorts us to remember our past adversity and God's faithfulness in it so that we don't turn away, so that we keep going forward, that we go on toward the victory. There's no neutrality in the Christian life. We're either moving toward or away from Christ. And so there's this exhortation. Don't forget the work that God has done in your life. And don't forget the work He has done through your life, and use that as motivation for present faithfulness. Hebrews jolts us awake to this reality and calls us to keep fighting, not to give in, and to endure until the end. This is Understanding Hebrews. Hebrews 7-8 demonstrates the supremacy of Christ's high priesthood over that of the Levitical priesthood. And Hebrews 9-10-18 emphasizes the supremacy of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice over and against the repeated sacrifices of animals. And in the last half of Hebrews 10, verses 19-39, which we're going to look at today, we receive an exhortation that applies these truths to everyday life. Since Christ's once-for-all sacrifice sanctifies us, sets us apart, and cleanses us from sin, we must live out of that reality, not just individually, but as a community, as a corporate body, as a local church. And so we draw near to God through Christ, and we also stir up one another to love and good deeds. We hold fast our confession and our hope. So the Christian life doesn't function on autopilot, but requires diligence, discipline, and an attentiveness to the needs of others. So we're going to dive into that first section to see the call to draw near to God, especially when we feel the temptation to turn away. Verses 19-25. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Christ, by the new and living way that He opened for us through the curtain, that is, through His flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for He who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Christ's blood and priesthood serve as two pillars upon which we find confident access to the presence of God. As mentioned earlier in Hebrews 9, the curtain which divides the holy place and the most holy place in the tabernacle, that's the tent, the mobile housing place of God that Moses constructed in the wilderness, that represents the inability of the old covenant under Moses to deal decisively with sin, the sin that alienates us from God's presence. So that dividing wall, that curtain, reveals to us symbolically that we don't have permanent access to God. Because of sin, because of the curse, we are distanced from God in a very visual way. And so we need a new and living way that never expires, but rather secures our eternal standing with God, secures our permanent access to the presence of God. And we get that through Christ. Christ's flesh and blood rips through that curtain once and for all and establishes our access to the heavenly most holy place, which is just a symbolic way of speaking of God's presence, right? It's the presence of God that we need access to. And so Christ's death, His shedding of blood, His tearing of His flesh, His giving of His life consecrated up to God through His death and resurrection It transitions God's plan of redemption from the limited access of the tabernacle under the old covenant with Moses to the full and permanent access of the new covenant under Christ, the great high priest who always lives to intercede for us. So we become God's house under God's high priest who serves not as a servant like Moses, but as a son. And he now shares this privilege of sonship with us as we become adopted children in God's house. And we grab onto this privilege of sonship by drawing near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. By faith, we draw near to God as his children. We trust in his promises. We trust in his goodness. We trust in the work that he has done on our behalf through Christ. And just as the priests in the Old Covenant washed themselves with different washing rituals in order to approach the holy place and the most holy place, so also the Spirit washes our conscience. And baptism symbolizes the washing of our bodies, the washing of our nature so that we are acceptable before God. And just as the priests had to sprinkle blood to sanctify all the instruments of the tabernacle and to sanctify themselves to be set apart for holy use, so also the Spirit sprinkles us with the blood of Christ, that we are set apart for a holy purpose to serve God. So we have a true cleansing and a true sprinkling of blood, which allows us to enter into the most holy place, into the very presence of God with safety and security and permanence. So we are the land that drinks the water of God's word and bears the fruit of righteousness, as we hear earlier in chapter 6 of Hebrews. Right? We don't bear thorns and thistles. We bear fruit because of our heart of faith, which comes by the grace of God who has transformed our hearts. And he transforms not just our hearts, but our whole selves, body and soul, for himself. Therefore, what's the implication? We must hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. If this is true, then the foundation of our confidence is not in ourselves, in how good we are, how moral we are, our best intentions, but rather in the sure promise of God. That's the nature of faith. Faith clings to the promise of God. And this is hard because life hits us in the face and it throws curveballs at us. We face persecution and alienation, maybe even mocking, and we need support. And that's where the community comes in. This requires us to stir up one another, to encourage, to literally put into someone else courage because, again, we're going to feel the pressure of wanting to turn away. The Israelites failed to believe God's promises and they died in the wilderness, despite seeing the presence and power of God in their midst. And we can't make that same mistake. So instead, we got to keep each day stirring one another up to love and good works, reminding each other of our commitment to obey Christ, to love Christ, reminding each other of the gospel, of what Christ has done on our behalf, that we are sprinkled clean, that we are washed by the Holy Spirit, and we need to live like that's true. And it's not going to be perfect, but the very fact that we have to continually remind each other shows that this is not for perfect people. This is not for people who are perfectly righteous, but for people who are pursuing righteousness by faith. They're motivated by faith. And this at least requires regular meetings. That's what we do when we gather for church. It's not just to hear a message. It's to minister to one another, to serve and to pray for one another, to hear the promises of God and to confirm those promises to one another through singing, through prayer, through encouraging one another just with words and showing our affection for one another. So the New Testament does not recognize the category of a lone wolf Christian, disconnected from the life of a church. It just simply doesn't exist. And apparently people in those days, they've gotten into the habit of not gathering together. But God intends the local church as the primary means by which he keeps his people on the path of righteousness and glory. Now, we can understand why maybe they're afraid to meet together. Maybe they don't want to be associated with other Christians because there's such a high cost to being identified with Christ. They don't want to deal with the mocking and the slander. They've already lost family relationships. They've already been thrown out of their synagogues. They've already had to take a hit perhaps in their business because now they're following this heretic named Jesus. And so you could see they're like, I want to just cool the jets a little bit and maybe stay away from my Christian community because it's bringing too much baggage with it. And Hebrews says, no, actually, when you feel pressure, that's exactly the moment when you need to rely on your community the most. That's exactly the moment that you need the most encouragement and you need the most stirring up to love and good deeds to continue. So if you want to hold your confession of hope without wavering, you're going to need the support of other people. And this requires urgency because the day is drawing near. Now, Hebrews works on two levels with reference to this day. Some of your translations may have day capitalized. Well, first, we see a near fulfillment in a few short years when the Roman army is going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And this climactic judgment ends the old covenant system once and for all. You can't go back to offer sacrifices because the temple's gone. There's no genealogical records. You can't reenact the priesthood of the old covenant anymore. God has historically, decisively ended the old covenant, and he does that just a few short years after Hebrews is written. So that's I think, the near fulfillment of this day drawing near. So he's saying, don't turn back to Judaism because Judaism's about to take, a major hit because the temple's going to be destroyed. But there's a further, second, greater fulfillment in the final day of judgment, in which God will execute justice upon all the nations. And that's a serious thing. And so there's an urgency instilled on both horizons. One, because the temple's going to be destroyed, and two, because God is going to judge all things at the end of time. And whichever horizon, obviously our horizon would be the final judgment of God, we're supposed to have an urgency with that. We're supposed to look around at the local church and say, is anybody lagging behind? Is anybody growing cold in their love and good deeds? How do I spur them on in love? I need to be spurred on in love and good deeds. We need these things constantly. And so don't get into the habit of not meeting together. Maybe in our modern day, we've got less noble reasons, perhaps, for not meeting together. We grow prosperous, we get a nice beach house, we just simply get busy with other pursuits. Sometimes we're just lazy. And Hebrews is a corrective against that, saying, no, you actually need this. You need to have an urgency about meeting together. Christ will return, which means we must remain faithful until the end, that we might receive what he promises. That is a key aspect of Hebrews. Endure until the end, and that means you need help. Well, let's go on to see the next little section, verses 26 to 31 of chapter 10. For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment, do you think, will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So Hebrews brings another warning to those who are tempted to fall away, to turn back to the old system, to turn back to Judaism with its high priest and sacrifices. There remains no further sacrifice if you spurn the sacrifice of Christ. If the old covenant under Moses brought severe earthly consequences for rejection and for idolatry and for turning away, well, how much more severe will the heavenly consequences of the new covenant be under Christ? So Hebrews describes turning away from Christ as worthy of God's furious judgment. Just as Christ brings eternal blessing when he's received, he also calls down eternal judgment when he's rejected. So he's trying to say, hypothetically, again, I don't think a Christian can actually lose their salvation, but he's, again, using a rhetorical device. He's giving a warning and saying, look, this is what it would mean if you were to turn back to Judaism. Let me give you a proper perspective and understanding of what this means. Returning to Judaism means, 1, trampling Christ underfoot. 2, spurning his sanctifying blood, treating it like it's common, like it's no big deal, like it's not precious. And finally, it is outraging the very Holy Spirit who sprinkles your conscience clean. You are going against the work of God. You are turning away from God. Don't think you can still have God and go back to Judaism. No, Christ is God. The Spirit is God, and the new covenant is God's fullness of his plan. And if you reject that, you are committing treason of the highest degree. Don't do it. Christ's blood sets us apart as holy. But those who turn away from that reject the blood and treat it as common, as ordinary. So this hyperbolic and hypothetical language is meant to properly frame the treason of apostasy, of turning away from Christ. Turning away from Christ means turning away from the living God, and he will bring vengeance. We often think Old Testament God, he's cranky, trigger happy, he's always judging people. New Testament God, super nice, super kind, everything. Now, Christ is kind, but he is also full of wrath and anger against sin. And the same God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, right? Christ is the God of the Old Testament, right? He is the one who executes judgment upon his people. And so there is continuity there. He's saying, if you think the restrictions, or rather the condemnations of sin under Moses are severe for idolatry and rejecting God, just wait till you see what condemnation is like under Christ. It's not just physical death, it is eternal death, eternal separation from God himself. So don't spurn the sacrifices. And again, literally in a couple years, the sacrificial system is going to be gone in 70 AD. Saying if you go back to Judaism, you're not going to literally have sacrifices left. So you are turning away from the only hope you have to deal with sin, which is the sacrifice of Christ. Now, the word judgment contains both a positive and a negative aspect. Those who are in Christ receive the judgment of being righteous, but those who reject him receive the judgment of wrath. So Jesus draws upon this concept in Luke 18:7-8. And will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? So the coming of the Son of Man echoes God's coming in judgment in the Old Testament. God came to Egypt, and his judgment delivered the Israelites and condemned Pharaoh and his household. And Christ's return is going to bring a judgment that vindicates the righteous and shames the wicked. And despite this warning, Hebrews encourages his audience to trust God and persevere through their trials. In other words, keep believing that the faith that justifies, the faith that counts as righteous, is a faith that will continue to live on and persevere. That's the kind of living active faith that we're supposed to have. And part of how we cultivate that faith is we use our past experience to motivate present obedience. Listen to verses 32-39. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Hebrews challenges Christians tempted to rest on the laurels of past obedience to continue on toward their final inheritance. If they turn back now, then their past suffering becomes meaningless and vain. And he brings to mind the public shame that they endured for following Christ, the compassion they demonstrated to those imprisoned for their faith, and their joyful acceptance of losing earthly possessions, being plundered. It's really incredible. And so the way that they live demonstrates that their hope rests in life beyond this world. But now that they've faltered in their confidence, they're putting their obtaining of that final inheritance at risk. And so the foundation of their confidence should rest not in their ability, but in God's ability, not only to fulfill his promises, but to sustain them in the present. So the solution is to exercise faith again. And the requirement of faith stretches all the way back to the Old Testament. Faith, again, is strengthened when we look at the faithfulness of God. So Hebrews quotes from Habakkuk 2:3-4. But he modifies the wording to make a rhetorical point. So we got to understand that the New Testament authors, they felt a certain freedom to modify the Old Testament passages, and they did this not to obscure the meaning, but rather to bring the meaning to the foreground. So Habakkuk 2:3-4 says this, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith." So in the original context, God promises judgment upon Judah in the form of an invading army because of their sins. Well, Hebrews escalates this historical judgment forward to the final judgment by replacing "it will surely come, it will not delay," which is a reference to God's judgment of bringing a foreign nation to judge Israel, to "the coming one will come and will not delay." So he projects out a historic judgment of a foreign nation disciplining Israel to the return of Christ at the end of time to judge the world. So just as God judged Judah for their disobedience, so Christ will return to judge all the nations in righteousness against their disobedience. Just as God's judgment appeared far off in Habakkuk's day, so too does the return of Christ. Yet the faithful remain vigilant, for his coming will not delay. They know that there will be final justice. And how do they respond to that promise of final justice? They live righteously in the present. So faith is the engine that drives our righteous living. Righteousness is the fruit of faith. It grows from the root of faith, if you want to think it that way. Again, think about it immediately. In a few short years, the Roman Empire, they're going to destroy the temple. So you need to stick with Christianity because the old system is going to go away. But even beyond that, God is going to judge all things. And will you be found righteous in him, or will you be found on your own merits and experience judgment? And in both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, God's righteous ones are always those who live by faith. It's always by faith. It's not like in the Old Covenant, it was just by works. New Covenant, now it's by faith. It was always by faith that people receive righteousness. It's always by faith that people live righteously. It's always by faith that people receive salvation. So faith animates the life of believers throughout all of redemptive history. Old Covenant, New Covenant, Old Testament, New Testament. And faith is entrusting oneself wholeheartedly to God. And that faith endures as faithfulness. So don't shrink back in light of God destroying the temple. Don't shrink back in light of Christ's second coming to judge the living and the dead, but keep fighting to keep the faith by fixing your eyes not on yourself or your visible circumstances, but in the invisible promise of God, in the invisible presence of God, working in the world and working in your life. We must endure many trials and tribulations, which means we've got to draw near to God. We can't take a passive approach to our faith. We need to draw on the resources he promises to give. We've got to draw near to each other. We need each other, especially when times get tough, when we are tempted to turn back. We need people stirring us up, and we need to consider, actively think about how to stir other people up to love and good deeds. To turn back means eternal destruction, but to endure means that we preserve our souls. We receive final salvation, the reward of our faith. This is not works righteousness, but rather the fruit of a genuine saving faith. And so we can't grow weary, but we stir one another up to love and good deeds, and we do it all the more as we see the day approaching.